So, ladies and gentlemen, we had some drama today in the 6 hours of Monza. And honestly, it got really heated between the three different hypercars that were remaining by the end of the race. We had some pretty crazy defenses, and at one point, two cars making contact and one of them getting damaged and being essentially put out of the race for the win. It's a pretty interesting situation. We've got that and a lot more to talk about from today's 6 hours of Monza. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get straight into it right now at the start of the race. So the start of the race, and really the first couple of hours into the race, weren't very action-packed. Most of the action really happened just before and then past the 3-hour mark of the race. But during the race, at the start, of course, you had Glickenhaus starting from pole, and they were able to essentially run off into the sunset right after that. Really, for the first 3 hours of the race, Glickenhaus was just, stretching their legs, getting out to, at one point, a 50-second lead ahead of the rest of the hypercar class. Glick was really showing a lot of pace in the beginning of the race, and as we'll talk about later, of course, that didn't end up working out, but it was really cool to see Glickenhaus putting the pace, running at the pace that they did throughout the beginning of the race. As for other things really that happened, you had Peugeot very early on in the race having mechanical issues and being forced to limp the car back to the pits. That was on the number 93 Peugeot. And that was after only 10 laps were done in the race. So literally after 10 laps, were stuck at the exit of the Ascari chicane, having to try to, slowly drive the car back to pit lane, getting help from marshals, figuring out technical issues and stuff like that, which, as I'll talk about in more detail later, it's interesting. Of course, I didn't expect much different, honestly, from Peugeot, considering they're a new team with new hybrid technology. It's not surprising that they're having technical issues of this kind, but it is, of course, disappointing for them. But that's really the main thing I could even note that happened in the first portion of the race. Essentially, the 93 ended up being stuck in the pits for the rest of the race and being a non-factor. After that, the next really interesting thing that happened was just before the 3-hour mark. So the number 33 TF Sport Aston was just coming out of the pits after a 50-second stop and hold penalty from a full course yellow infringement. And coming into the second chicane, it looked like there was some type of mechanical malfunction on the car, likely a front brake failure, essentially from the way the car spun. And going into the chicane, the car, like I had said, spun around, lost the front end, got sideways, hit one of the long sausage curb anti-cut things, and launched off of the side of it, did a full flip, landed on the top of the car, and rolled over across the track into the wall on the other side, and came to a rest upside down. Now, the driver, Henrique Chavez, was okay after the crash, but it was definitely a scary thing to watch and a scary thing to see on the replay. Now, the main thing I want to note here, before we get into any discussion about anti-cut curbs, which I think I'm going to do a video about later on this week, is that when the car hit the curb, the side door of the car blew off, which made it a very dangerous situation. Now, luckily, it was on the passenger side of the car, so it wasn't in a position where the driver was going to be, taking the brunt of an impact or something, but it's still very scary to see the door of a car blow off in a crash that's just starting to happen, considering he hadn't even hit any walls yet to slow down. But it's a really scary situation that you really don't want to see in racing, and as I had said, I'm going to be making a video about really what's been going on with these anti-cut curbs recently, because there's definitely a bit of a movement right now on social media to get rid of them, and honestly, I'm in support of it. After seeing what happened here, I think it's becoming more obvious that it's just not worth the risk. But anyways, that, of course, brought out a safety car, And during that, it was announced that Glickenhaus had a a drive-through penalty for speeding under a full course yellow. There was a full course yellow just a slight bit before that for a single car incident that ended up not doing much. But anyways, that meant that Glick not only lost their 50-second lead that they had from the safety car, but also were going to be forced to do a drive-through penalty. They weren't able to do that under the safety car. It wasn't exactly clear if they were technically allowed to do it, but Glickenhaus essentially couldn't confirm that they were allowed to, so just didn't do it because they're still going to be able to have a chance at, being competitive afterwards, as I'll talk about in a second. So they weren't able to serve that penalty under the safety car. During that safety car, the entire HyperCar field came in and pitted, and Glickenhaus lost the lead for the first time in the race. Now, granted, it was because the Toyota had not taken tires, and Glickenhaus had. Of course, when you're trying to kind of fight back through everyone, they were going to want fresh tires, and likely were at the end of a stint anyways. But that put Glickenhaus second in the restart, and of course, right after the restart, they came in and took their drive-through penalty, which put them 30 seconds behind the rest of the HyperCar field. Now, it went on for a few laps after that, and it looked like Glickenhaus was, gaining some decent amount of time. Of course, they were going to have to, go through the GTE and LMP2 field after that, considering that 30-second penalty, of course, put them behind everyone. So they were having to go through that field while the rest of the HyperCar field was essentially getting to pull away out front. But they were still gaining some decent amounts of time. And then, all of a sudden, the engine blew. The car started spewing smoke out the back of it, and that spelled the end of the race for Glickenhaus. It was honestly a really disappointing end, and considering it all happened within about 30 minutes, it went from Glickenhaus leading by 50 seconds to Glickenhaus getting a penalty and a safety car and being out of the race. It was really disheartening for a team like Glickenhaus, especially considering their situation, being a smaller team. They're out, having the time of their life leading the race, and then all of a sudden, it all comes crashing down. And it was really disappointing to see that from Glickenhaus. And as we'll talk about later, that could spell some issues for them in the future. But it was really disappointing to see that for Glickenhaus. They had been fast all weekend, and it really looked like they were going to be able to possibly get their first HyperCar win ever, but sadly, it did not work out. And honestly, I think this, considering the future with LMDH teams joining, and of course more even HyperCar teams joining the next few years, this might have been their best chance ever to win a race, and it's sad that it had to end that way. But that was the end for Glickenhaus, which meant that there were only 4 HyperCars left. And shortly after that, the number 94 Peugeot, which was already running in 4th a lap down, encountered their own technical issues, meaning there were only 3 HyperCars left in the race, being the 2 Toyotas and the Alpine. Now, Alpine, for a short amount of time during that, the last 3 hours of the race, were able to get out to a decent lead, but it seemed like when they were fighting the Toyotas, they were having issues keeping up, because essentially, the Alpine is lighter, so it's going to be faster in the corners, but on the straightaways, they have less power than the Toyota. So even with the draft, the Alpine was having issues, passing the Toyota. They were able to stay with them, of course, since they're faster in the corners, less braking, stuff like that. But they weren't able to stay with them on the straightaways enough to get to where they could actually pass them, which made it was quite hard for Alpine to really get past the Toyotas, even though they were able to catch them quite easily. And it made for just a bit of an interesting but also somewhat disappointing battle, considering that it seemed like the Alpine was always just a car length behind where they needed to be to try to, make a pass. But Toyota was, it was still back and forth with pit stops and stuff. Alpine was able to hold the lead for a decent amount of time. With a little over an hour left in the race, Alpine and the number 7 Toyota were fighting coming down the front straightaway. And Kamui Kobayashi, who was driving the number 7 at that time, I just wanted to double check that it was the number 7, was essentially trying to defend from the number 36 Alpine, and he was in front of him by just a little bit. It looked like he hadn't quite cleared him yet, but he had almost all of his car in front of the Alpine, and he kept forcing him down to the inside of the track, pushing further and further towards the white line and I guess the grass coming into the chicane in turn 1. And eventually the Alpine decided that he wasn't going to give anymore. And Kamui Kobayashi kept pushing over. So eventually they made contact, which meant that the number 7 car had a right rear puncture from the bodywork on the Alpine, causing that puncture, which also caused some more damage to the back of their car. They had to come in and get that fixed, and of course fix the tire. They were already going to be out of contention at that point. And then they also got a 90-second stop and hold penalty for the collision, which, I mean, I guess adding insult to injury, but they definitely deserved it because it was very obviously Kamui pushing way too far in defending from the Alpine. He was essentially trying to take space that wasn't there and trying to see if the Alpine would just kind of give up. And the Alpine had a right to that position. So Toyota just kept, pushing the limits, and eventually, something was going to happen. And Toyota got the short end of the stick on that. I guess the good thing in this situation was that it wasn't the Alpine that ended up getting damage. It was the Toyota, because it's their fault. But it was definitely interesting to watch. This is, we haven't really seen a lot of very close battles like this in the HyperCar division, so it's cool to see for the first time in quite a while, big fights for the lead in the top class. Of course, it's odd to see it end in this way, but of course, I guess that's a little bit of drama that we could, work on for the next couple of races. That's probably wishful thinking. But, yeah, so it was definitely interesting to see a team like Toyota, and especially from a driver like Kamui Kobayashi, who's their, team leader, team principal, whatever, also as a driver, making a move like that. It's very odd to see from a team like Toyota for something like that to happen, but it did, and that essentially spelled the end of the race for the number 7. The number 8 at that point was just a few seconds behind, and essentially stayed there for the rest of the race. The final gap at the end of the race was 2.7 seconds, and it was really bumbling between there and 5 seconds, depending on what happened when they were passing traffic and during the last pit cycle. But Alpine was able to maintain that lead, and they came home to take their second win of the year. So, of course, Alpine is already leading the championship at this point. They're going to lead the championship by even more now after Monza. And considering that it was the number 7 that they're going to be fighting for the championship right now, and they finished 3rd, it's definitely not the ending that Toyota would have wanted. Considering that the championship is really the main focus now in the last, we're going to have 2 races left. This race definitely didn't exactly go ideally for Toyota, considering the circumstances they ended up in. It's weird to see, Toyota throwing away chances at wins like that. When you see stuff like that happen from a team like Toyota, it really seems like a missed opportunity for them. They could have won. They could have had a 1-2, honestly. They probably wouldn't have, considering the 8 was second. But Kobayashi threw away a chance at winning the race, trying to defend, and it's just definitely interesting to see that from Toyota. So Alpine is now leading the championship by even more. Coming into the last 2 races, I'm not well versed in the championship standings, and I can't find exact numbers, but my guess is that it's going to be somewhere around 10 or 15 points that they're leading by, which is a decently sized gap for Toyota to make up. Of course, it's possible, definitely. Obviously, Toyota is at no lack of pace, and these last 2 tracks are tracks that they have a lot of experience with from both this car and their TS050 from a couple of years ago. So yeah, that's really most of what's been going on in the HyperCar class. I really haven't talked much about other, battles within certain different classes, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about that now. So, in the LMP2 class, you had WRT winning, the number 41 real team by WRT car winning, and they were probably the dominant team most of the race. Really, it seemed like at certain points you had the number 22 United Autosports car and the number 9 Prema car, of course, who were competitive, especially early in the race. But by the end of the race, it seemed like the number 41 was really just able to kind of start to pull away and was able to take the victory in class. Second was the number 38 Jota car, who, ran a good race. They were able to kind of start to, work their way towards the front near the end of the race. Third was the number 10 Vector Sport car, similar to Jota, worked their way up at the end of the race. Fourth is the number 34 Inter Europol car. Now, it's a bit of a surprise, just generally, considering that Inter Europol is generally one of the lower ranked LMP2 teams. But it's definitely nice to see them come out and perform this week, and, pretty good for Inter Europol. So moving on to the GTE Pro Battle, which is actually probably what I should have talked about first when I was talking about other classes, because actually this was a really interesting battle, and it definitely ended differently than it looked like it was going to, because Porsche and Ferrari were having quite the heated battle for position at certain points during the race, especially near the end, and by the end, it actually got heated enough that we had contact and drivers getting penalties handed out for that contact. So, taking home the victory in class was the sleeper team, and I guess the team that avoided all of the accidents and incidents was the number 64 Corvette, taking their first win of the year in GTE Pro. Second was the number 52 AF Corsa car, which looked like they were going to be winning for most of the end of the race. But, of course, at the end, the Corvette was able to pull out the win. Third, the number 51 AF Corsa car, who probably, in the 2 hours to go to about the hour to go window, looked like they were going to be the team that was going to win, but they had some issues that put them further down in the GTE Pro field. Fourth was the number 92 Porsche, and fifth was the number 91 Porsche. So, the main thing I want to talk about is the battle between the 51 and the 92, which got very heated. Of course, it was a very close battle. GTE Pro, generally, despite having very few cars, has pretty close battles for position. Coming into the second chicane on one of the laps, the number 51 AF Corsa car was ahead, and these guys had been pushing each other around for a while, so they were obviously, pretty upset at that point, and they've had some history from races like Bahrain last year. Anyways, coming into the second chicane, the 51 car was ahead of the 92 and had ran the 92 out wide at the Curva Grande. Coming into the braking zone, the 92 essentially just decides, no, I'm not braking, I'm not stopping here, and just kind of hit the bumper of the 51 a couple of times and shoved him straight on through the corner. And Kevin Estra had gotten a penalty for that and contact with an LMP2 that he had at some point. We didn't hear much about. Essentially, that meant that the 51 was going to be ahead of the 92, and that was really it for that GTE Pro battle. It's definitely interesting to see drivers, especially like Kevin Estra, getting that aggressive and competitive over positions like that. Of course, you're battling for position. I'd say, what else do you expect? But then again, it is interesting to see a driver of his caliber just kind of moving other cars out of the way, just really in frustration more than anything else. Is definitely odd to see that happening. And it was odd to see that Porsche seemed to not be performing as well as they had been doing in practice. I talked about that yesterday, how in practice it seemed like they were really showing a lot of race pace, and Ferrari, of course, had some better one-lap pace, and even Ferrari had even acknowledged that when they were doing some interviews with them. But seemed like in the race, just Porsche didn't have much. They were really stuck near the back for most of the time. And it looked like the battle for the win was mainly between the two AF Corsa cars, and the Corvette would eventually get in there. Of course, that ended up not being how it worked out, but that was the way it worked out for Porsche. So it was odd to see that happening. So last thing I'm going to talk about here is the GTE AM battle, which of course, the team that started from pole was the all-female Iron Dames team, with Sarah Bovey's pole lap from yesterday, and they were surprisingly competitive today. I'd say even with the pole, I didn't necessarily expect that they were going to go out and compete for wins. That car is generally kind of middle of the road in GTE AM, but they were, to their credit, extremely competitive today. They held the lead for a lot of the race. They were in the top 3 for a lot of the race. They ended up finishing second behind the number 77 Dempsey Proton car, who very late in the race had to stop for gas. So it looked like it was possible that the 85 was even going to pull out a win, but it ended up that ended up not happening, and the number 77 car won. Of course, 85 Iron Dames was second. Third in GTEM was the Team Project 1, number 46. Fourth was the Iron Lynx, number 60, and fifth was the number 71 Spirit of Race car. I'd say, it was, of course, a good weekend for the Iron Dames team. That's great to see them being competitive. It'll be interesting to see if that kind of translates over to the next couple of races, or if this was more of a, this is a good track for them. I don't know, but I'd say that's something to watch in GTE AM. Of course, we talked about the number 33 TF Sport car. They were quite decently competitive. I believe they were leading before they had the penalty that they took before the crash. So that, of course, took out a competitive car. But the main concern there is obviously for the driver safety, which we'll talk about in another video, I think, later on this week. I'm going to talk about sausage curbs. But yeah, I guess that's about all I have for Monza. So just general wrap up, I'd say this was a pretty interesting race. It's definitely a bit of a disappointment for the level of competition I was expecting, but I'd also say that I was probably a bit overconfident in what I was expecting. I'd say a lot of that also stemmed from the fact that, Glickenhaus retired, both of the Peugeots had issues, and one of them retired, one of them just lost a bunch of laps fixing stuff like that kind of took away from the overall competitiveness a little bit, but you still had a really good battle between Alpine and Toyota. It was just disappointing not to see Glickenhaus and Peugeot up there. Of course, with Glickenhaus having issues, I think this race did go really well. And honestly, from what I've seen, I think this might have been the best hypercar battle we've seen, since the class started last year. I think this was a really good race, and honestly, it shows a lot of promise for the next couple of races before the end of the year. Of course, then before you get into having more LMH teams, all the LMDH teams joining, stuff like that is really where you start to get into the, this could be really fun to watch. But I think even for having only 6 cars, I was expecting a crazy competitive race. It didn't exactly turn out to be that, but it was more because of the mechanical issues that teams ran into. I think, other than that, it was a great race. I really enjoyed this, and I think for HyperCar, it shows a lot of promise for the next couple of races. Yeah, so last, I think the only other thing I want to talk about here is Glickenhaus and the possible implications of their engine issues, which, of course, I think it's already official that they're not doing Fuji because of financial problems. Essentially, they're not going to be able to, comfortably get to Fuji and be able to run without having financial issues. What I wonder is, does this engine issue put a possibility that they could not end up racing at Bahrain either? Because, of course, blowing an engine isn't an easy thing to fix. That isn't a cheap thing to fix. And considering they're already kind of, on a bit of a shoestring budget, it's possibly a concern that Glickenhaus won't be able to run at Bahrain in November, though, of course, there's a lot of time for that to figure itself out. You don't really know, but that's something to possibly watch for the next couple of weeks. But that's about all I have. It was a pretty good 6 hours of Monza. I'd say, the race went really well, and honestly, I'm glad that we have a decently close hypercar battle now. So that's about all I have. Thank you guys all so much for watching. I'll see you all sometime later this week where we're going to talk about the, benefits versus possible risks of the sausage curbs. So thank you guys all so much for watching. I'll see you all then. Bye.